Well, thank you very much, Brian. Do we have a few thumbs up that you can actually see a green screen with a fantastic painting on it? Thank you, that's wonderful. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us this evening for this short talk, which is about this wonderful new book. I do hope you enjoy both the book and this talk. It is about the Railway Navvies of Settle, the end of the line, and as it says there, the story of the navvies who gave their lives to build the Settle and Carlisle Railway. The cover of the book is there in front of us, with the most beautiful painting on there by a good friend of mine and local artist, Teresa Gordon, who I think is with us this evening as well, beautifully illustrated throughout. The book was funded by the Friends of the Settle Carlisle Line, the Settle and Carlisle Railway Trust, and Stories in Stone, which is part of the Yorkshire Dales Millennium Trust, supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So if you've ever bought a lottery ticket, thank you very much. Okay, so let's see what this book is all about. First of all, my name is Sarah Lister, but my maiden name was Sarah Yule. Some of you may have seen that name before. I'm just mentioning it because people like to make links. In 1962, that engine there, which is an N7 class engine, the last one to be built at the Stratford Works, was bought by my dear father from British Rail. And he did it up. There it is, 6961, there he is, bless his cotton socks. And there it is being transported to the East Anglian Railway Museum, which it is today. He also founded the Middleton Railway Trust in Leeds. So as you can tell, railways were quite an important part of my childhood, with just about every weekend spent down at Middleton. And a few years ago, my husband and I got married on the engine again as well. Of course, it's not working at the moment because the boiler's broken, which is always the case. But anyway, I have some railway credentials, but I'm in no way an expert, and I hope I don't cause offence to anyone who is. So that's a little bit about me. As I said, thank you for joining us this evening. Some of you are local, and nice to see some familiar faces. And we do have people coming from a long way away, and it's great to see Christy here from America, who's joining us from all over there. So lovely to see you. Now, this whole project, this whole book was written as part of Settle Graveyard Project. Here we are at the parish church in Settle. And there are a few of us looking at gravestones because the whole project started when we decided to record inscriptions from the gravestones before they wore away. And as we were looking at them, we were thinking, well, hang on a minute, it's all very well recording these inscriptions, but who were these people and what did they do? And that was the beginning of the Settle Graveyard Project. And ever since then, I've had a sort of full-time hobby finding out. And it's led on to all sorts of things, including talks, graveyard tours, and the publication of a book also by Stories in Stone, which has gone from strength to strength. And this work is part of that project. Now, Settle Church is defined by the railway. This is a picture of the railway, the church in the early 1880s, just after the railway had been built. With a wall all around it with its graveyard. Now, the tower in that picture, if you go up to the top of the tower and get yourself a camera and take some pictures today on a nice day, you find these. This is looking down and you can see that the graveyard is nestled beneath the embankment of the railway as it leaves Settle out towards Langcliffe. And so the railway and the church are integrally linked, as we shall see. And these days, when we're doing a graveyard tour, it's very common for steam trains to pass over. The railway is an integral part of Settle life, and we sort of take it for granted, although it's such a treat to have steam trains going through. And some of you will recognise those two engines. We can have a quiz at the end if you like. Now, what about these navvies? Now, in the porch of Holy Ascension Church, just as you're going in on the right, there is a large plaque which has this inscribed on it: to the memory of those through accidents lost their lives in constructing the railway works between Settle and Dent Head. This tablet was erected at the joint expense of their fellow workers and the Midland Railway Company, 1869 to 1876. Now, some of you will know that there is a matching plaque up in St Leonard's Church at Chapel le Dale, which is the closest church to Ribblehead, where famously we know there are many navvies buried there. The plaque that's there now in St Leonard's is a replacement. The original, of course, is in York Railway Museum. Now, obviously, we know about the navvies buried in Ribblehead, and we know there are 215 burials of navvies and their families. We also know that at Dent there are 72, and at Malastang there are 25. But because we've got this damn great plaque here in Settle, does that mean there were some in Settle? And I asked the railway people, and I asked the church, and nobody knew. People said, oh, I think there's probably 4 or 5. And as I was doing the project, I obviously looked through the burial records for any clues. The burial records up at St Leonard's are easy because it says next to their name where they were when they died, and obviously they were living in the navvy huts with names that you'll be familiar with, Jericho, Sebastopol, etc. Whereas the burial records in Settle haven't got those because the navvy huts didn't have distinctive names and they weren't necessarily living in the navvy hut. So, in order to work out who were the navvies, if there were any, I did a shortlist from the burial records, and very kindly, the Friends of the Settle in Carlisle paid for the death certificates for the people I suspected might be navvies. And so, with the help of some quality research time during lockdown, I found some answers. And it's taken 150 years, which I think is such a shame. These men gave their lives for this railway, and it's taken us that long to find out how many there were and who they were, where they came from, how they died, and that sort of information. However, it's the project has told us far more than about just the deaths of St Navvies. It's a rich, colourful picture, which I hope you will enjoy. I don't need to tell you, it would be preaching to the converted to tell you the statistics about the railway, and that's in the book and it's online, so we won't go through that. Obviously, the Acts were put through Parliament, and then there was quite a bit of political wrangling for several years before it actually took place. And it just made me smile. I'm not going political at all, but if you look at the HS2 website, they've got this on there. What is HS2? It's a new high-speed railway linking up the London Midlands and northern Scotland over 25 stations, including 8 of Britain's 10 largest cities and connecting around 30 million people. You can just imagine in 1866, very similar arguments were being put forward for the Settle and Carlisle Railway as well. So things come a whole cycle again. So, one of I can't, obviously, I'm not going to tell you everything in the book, we would be here far too long, but I'll give you some of the snippets to give you a taste of what the book's about. One thing that's come through is a very colourful picture of what was happening in Settle while the railway was being built. Now, some of you don't live in Settle, some of you do, so apologies if I don't get enough of the detail right for you. If you live in Settle these days, you will know, if you visited Settle, it's a very quiet little market town. Not too much really happens of any big deal. But if you go on social media in Settle, you get complaints about the usual things, the amount of litter, the amount of dog poo, whether the ice cream van should be selling ice cream from where it's selling, and during lockdown, the fact that there were far too many people here and it shouldn't be allowed. And this is the way that social media works. But if we went back 150 years, we found from an account in a paper reflecting on the time, an article like this. The making of the Settle and Carlisle Railway was a very important event in the history of Settle. It brought into the town and neighbourhood an alien population, and soon after operations began, the voice of the Cockney was heard in the land. Well, that's quite interesting because from my research, there weren't that many Cockneys and there were plenty of other accents as well. Huts were erected to house the workmen and their families, although it doesn't say there that actually quite a sizable proportion of the navvies that came in actually lodged with people in Settle. A Tommy shop was established in an old barn at the bottom of Duke Street to supply food, etc., and there were scenes of bustle and excitement in the somnolent little town. As a rule, the newcomers were well behaved, but occasionally quarrels arose which led to fights in the fields outside the town. Such fistic encounters, no doubt the derivation of fisticuffs, as these took place, were practically unknown in Settle, and I can recall several ghastly exhibitions which we youngsters witnessed with horror. The contestants, stripped to the waist, faced each other in a ring formed by partisans and other spectators, and then began a display of brute force which increased in violence until one, or in some instances, both were incapacitated and covered with blood. It was not an edifying spectacle, and I merely mention it to show how an alien element were able to destroy the quietude of our peaceful community. So I'm sure it had a massive impact. Nothing like this had ever happened before in Settle, and it wouldn't again. Well, not so far anyway. Was this reputation of the navvies justified? Well, there were loads of newspaper reports about assault, theft, and no end of crime. And there was even a charge of murder, where a navvy killed a beer seller in Glencliff, which is just outside Settle. You couldn't make it up if you wanted to. The beer seller was 75 years old, and he only had one arm, his left arm, and he was knocked over by Ellis Parker, alias Nelson. Well, that's suspicious anyway, and he died. So there was quite a bad reputation. A contemporary report did say the very name navvy has passed into a synonym for all that is rough and uncouth. But although it is not far from the truth, there are navvies and navvies. So there were good ones and there were bad ones. There was quite a lot of work put into trying to work with the navvies to improve their lifestyles, the middle classes, providing entertainment, providing singing, providing education. And we know the adult education classes multiplied in attendance while the railway was being built. So it was a mixed picture. Without doubt, the railway transformed life in Settle. Businesses flourished. Everyone appreciated the benefits it could bring. Settle got its first fish and chip shop, courtesy of the railways bringing fresh fish. But the locals were not so keen on the navvies and the families themselves. Okay, so through Settle, if you know Settle, it is literally a series of embankments and cuttings and viaducts, right from Settle Junction, where it cuts off from the Leeds-Lancaster line, all the way through up the valley to Dent Head. Uphill, hence the long drag. The famous quote about this part of the Settle and Carlisle, all by pick and shovel. So a massive engineering feat requiring the river to be rerouted, etc. Now, there are several contemporary sources which describe what was going on, and I'll just read a couple of these if you're sitting comfortably with your cup of tea. This first one is about the centre of Settle. It said the railway yard, which is a little on the east side of Settle, is a place of much excitement on account of the various occupations going on. The ringing of anvils, the hammering of carpenters, the tramp of heavy horses, the puffing, steaming and whistling of locos, the different keyed voices of workmen, the clang of cutting, grinding, crushing and sawing machinery, and the quick motions of persons on business, all tended to give the place an aspect of unusual activity and restlessness. The railway yard included within its wooden precincts a saddler's shop, a carpenter's shop, sawmill, storerooms, a 7-flute smithy, numerous wooden huts, and 2 stables fit for 40 horses. The stables were very clean, and the few horses that were there were in excellent condition. And it carries on. It is the dinner hour, and a strange silence prevails throughout the works. Navvies are taking their siesta on the great piled-up balks of timber in various and grotesque attitudes, apparently sleeping as composedly and certainly snoring as satisfactorily as any alderman could hope to do on his feather bed. So a real picture there of life in Settle, very different to now and very different to the way Settle was before. It was a very colourful life. It was rough and it was amazing in what it's achieved, but so different for the people of Settle. Now, there's been several mentioned already, and there's a lot of discussion in the media about navvy huts. There's Mark, who I think is with us tonight, with a navvy hut that is in his yard outside the water tower in Settle, a proper converted, genuine, authentic, original navvy hut. And the navvy huts were important in Settle and all the way up the line. There were navvy huts in 4 different areas within Settle, some at Runley Bridge, Goldielands, if you know Settle, Marshfield and Ashfield. And in those 4 areas, there were 39 huts, each with between 10 and 15 people in them. So that's a lot of navvies. And remember, there are many others who are lodging with families in Settle. So we have a huge number of people coming into the area. Many will have applied to adverts, as in the top right, advertising, you know, good wages and good accommodation. And this navvy hut here is run by George and Jane Gibbs. He's a railway miner. This is actually up at Garsdale. Typically, the navvy hut was run by the wife with their family at one end of the hut and lodgers at the other end of the hut. If you can see, it's depending on the size of your screen, they have several children. You can see from the births of the children on the right, this family have travelled Gloucester, Cornwall, Derbyshire and Stanage. And that George Gibbs worked for the same company and actually travelled all of those locations are the places where that company were building railways. So this chap followed the company round. You can see if the ages between the births of the children, there's a gap there. A couple of children had died, child mortality was high. And then we've got all the boarders who came from all over the place. None of them were Cockneys, but they came from Lichfield, Liverpool, Devon, Herefordshire, Suffolk, etc. And typically the lodgers were single men, young men, who were from all over the place. One of those is typical that he probably has made up his name. His name is Francis Frattlefarty from Lichfield, and maybe he had a personal hygiene problem, but you cannot trace him. I did try and find him, but obviously that was a made-up name, which was not at all uncommon. And they'll have come for work. Cornish mines are declining and the agriculture is being replaced by machinery. So this was good work for those people. There were also provisions for these people. It's a lot of extra people, and Burgoyne and Cox were the proprietors. They advertised in the local almanac, and they also at the end put on a slap-up meal for the workers once the railway was finished at the Royal Oak Hotel, which still survives in Settle to this day. They didn't just come and work for the railway, they tended to work in gangs. Contracts were let out to a gang leader who got his gang, his clan, to work for him. And they identified themselves with the type of hat that they wore or a certain necktie that they wore. It's a bit like Peaky Blinders up at the railways because they were working these gangs. Fiercely loyal to each other if it was against whatever, but there was a lot of competition between them as well. And I love this quote on the right. The delivery of letters by the postman is in such a collection of huts is a task of surprising difficulty. Very few men are distinguished by their proper names. When at first a man comes to a job, his fellows are on the lookout for some peculiarity, and if they detect one, they apply a name to it, which its possessor is known for years. It may be Lanky, Gloucester, Soldier, Nobby, Cuddy, Caleb, and scores of other names are given, so that it must have puzzled the census taker to get a correct schedule of the denizens of these bleak moors. And not surprising too, and probably that's why Francis Frattlefarty actually got there. Okay, so who were these navvies then? Here they are. We have 20 of them plus 2 apprentices, and that is their names and their ages. Their average age is 30.2, the youngest is 16, the oldest is 64. 5 of these were from Settle roundabout, the others further afield, including 1 from Anglesey and 3 from Ireland. No Scots in this lot and no Cockneys in this lot either. 8 of them were married, 1 was widowed, the rest were all single. Of the ones that were married, they had an average of 2 children as well, who were left without a dad when the worst came to the worst. Now on the railway, I love this painting, and Alan Fernley, some of you will know Alan, did this fantastic painting of Ribblehead, which for me sums up the spirit of it all. A lot of portrayals these days of the navvies are of this sterling achievement and understated heroism, but the gritty reality was that these were working class men who literally just wanted to put food on the plate. If they had a plate, they probably had a plate, but they just needed food. They probably weren't thinking, oh yes, this is a more dangerous job than normal, which is why it's being paid at a higher salary. They just needed the money. They just needed to survive. They probably didn't also think, I wonder if in 150 years' time, whether this will be regarded as one of the world's best, most scenic railways either. This was just another job. Now, the navvies, when we use the term navvies, it covers a variety of occupations which are given there. 2 apprentices, 13 described as a railway labourer, a couple of miners, tunnellers, engine stoker, carpenter, a smith mechanic, and a couple of stonemasons, as you can see. And the distribution of deaths in this sample, you can see 1872 was a very bad year. Now, all of these men were buried in Settle. This was their final resting place. At Chapel le Dale, none of the navvies have gravestones, but 5, 6 of our navvies do have gravestones. There's 2 in 1 grave here. They all ended up in Settle, although they died all along the line between here and Ribblehead. So how did they end up in Settle? Well, the reasons could be because they required a hospital which had more facilities than the hut up at Ribblehead, so they brought here for hospital before they died. Or there could have been a coroner's hearing down in Settle. If the coroner didn't fancy going further afield, he could have insisted that the bodies were brought down to Settle. Either way, this is where they ended up, in the Settle graveyard, and details are in the book. Now, of death. Now, of the people that we looked at, the 22, the 20 plus 2 apprentices, 10 died from accidents, 9 from infectious disease, 1 from liver disease, and 2 from heart disease. Now, oh, apologies, the internet's, hope you can still see me, it says the internet's a bit dodgy. In the 19th century, 1/3 of all deaths across the population were by infectious disease. We think we're having a tough time now with COVID, but 1/3 of all deaths by infectious disease during the 19th century. Obviously, before antibiotics and an understanding of just basic good hygiene, this was just a fact of life. And we know there were outbreaks of smallpox and cholera, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, all through, and it was just what happened with families. However, far more of the deaths finished off our navvies. Navvy huts were crowded places, navvy working environments were crowded places. Social distancing hadn't been invented in those days, and let's face it, if you were a navvy, you didn't get sick pay, you just had to go out there and do your job anyway. And so they travelled around the country, harbouring germs, taking them with them to the next place of work, and so they spread. And we know there was a horrific outbreak of smallpox in 1872, which killed 80 people who were all buried up at Chapel le Dale. Anyway, none of ours actually died of smallpox down here. They managed not to, but 7 died of lung disease, sometimes not specified, sometimes pneumonia, 2 of continued fever, 2 of heart disease, 1 and a bit of liver disease. If you want to know how you can have a bit of liver disease, one chap had liver disease alongside other things as well. So those are the diseases that they suffered from. And if we just look at one example of one of the navvies who died of disease, there's a navvy called Robert Ralph. Now, Robert was actually Settle born and bred. Ralph is a good Settle name. And at the time of the 1871 census, which is in the midst of the railway being built, there were actually 6 Robert Ralphs who were all related. And this Robert Ralph was the son of, you guessed it, another Robert Ralph. And he had married a woman called Mary Dale in 1858, and they'd had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The son was called Robert, of course, but Robert had died an infant. This Robert was a stonemason, and we know that stonemasons were incredibly in demand in the building of the railway. In the 1851 census, there were 19 stonemasons in Settle. In the 1871 census, that had shot up to 67, so more than triple the numbers. So an awful lot of stonemasons coming in from around the place. If you're in Settle like Robert, your luck was in. You didn't have to go anywhere, and all of a sudden you got all the work you could possibly want. However, in 1874, in May of 1874, the unthinkable happened. May the 11th, Mary, his wife, died. aged 42. And on the 24th of May, just 13 days later, Robert himself died, aged 41. So remember, we've got 2 daughters who are now orphaned within the space of a couple of weeks. Now, Robert's death certificate shows he died of phthisis, which is tuberculosis. He also has disease of the liver, which is a reflection on the alcohol required to sustain the navvies, and also general dropsy, which is just swelling, edema, which is probably linked to both of the above diseases. And so the chances are that his poor wife will have died at least of one of those that she was sharing with him. And a woman called Mary Sewell recorded the death. Now, we know there were 2 daughters. Robert and Mary are buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the ancient graveyard in Settle. Their daughters were brought up separately by 2 of Robert's sisters. One sister had married John Sanderson, who was the landlord of the Talbot Inn. If you've been to Settle, you've probably been in there. Unfortunately, that daughter, who was called Anne, spent the last 20 years of her life in an asylum and died aged 46. The other daughter, Mary Jane, was brought up by her aunt Mary Sewell, who is the woman who has recorded this death here. She had married Aaron Sewell, who was another stonemason who'd come to Settle from Cockermouth to work on the railway. Mary and her husband Aaron had several children, but unfortunately the oldest 2 of those, Thomas and Emily Alice, died aged 1 and 2 at the beginning of 1876 within 5 days of each other. So really bad luck there. They moved away with Robert's daughter Mary Jane. Mary Jane had an illegitimate son called Robert, who died in infancy, but then she married a chap called Sutcliffe Scott, who worked in the cotton mills and had a large family. So that's the sort of silver lining thing to cling on to for that family. And unfortunately, Robert Ralph lived next to a neighbour. His neighbour was a chap called Robert Henry Jackson, who was unfortunately another navvy who died, and his story is in the book. So not a good one there. Just while we're talking of navvy families, the book is mainly about the navvies themselves, but also in the burial records are all of these people who are relations of navvies. The bottom of the first column is Grace Kellam, who was 61. She was the mother of Worrell Kellam, who was a very naughty boy, and his account is in the book. We also have in the 3rd column, second down, these are in chronological order, Mary Ralph there, who was the wife of Robert we've just seen, and the 2 children at the bottom are the infant children of Mary Sewell there as well. But everybody else just about is an infant or a child. So grim statistics, which unfortunately was not too unusual. In the first 15 years of the graveyard, 42% of the burials were for children 5 and under. It was a tough life in the 19th century. But obviously child mortality was higher for the navvies because of the living conditions. Now, that was a death by disease, which was grim. However, we also had some deaths by accident. Now then, these are the accidents that affected our navvies, that killed them. There were 10 accidents. 9 of them required a coroner's inquest, who gave this statement as to the reasons that they died. The last one at the bottom, with a compound fracture of the right leg and an infection, was an accident, but for some reason that didn't get a coroner's inquest. So I don't know why it didn't get a coroner's inquest, but it didn't. But you can see there are some pretty grim things there happen to people. And some of the most common is to do with wagons, wagons crushed between 2 wagons. We've got a mortal injury from a piece of timber falling on his head. He was a carpenter, so that was a very unfortunate one. Dynamite cartridge in a tunnel, far more deaths by dynamite cartridge as you go further up the line, obviously. And unfortunately found dead in the River Ribble with no marks of violence upon his person. He'd had too much to drink the night before. And when he thought about working on the railway, he probably didn't think that drowning the Ribble because he'd had too much to drink was a likely outcome, but it was. So let's have a look at a couple of these. First of all, we've got John Jones. Now, John Jones is one of the ones with a gravestone. And if we have a look at his gravestone, you can read it, or if you can't read it, I shall read it to you. I must say, it's a very fine gravestone. Some of you have seen the article in the Yorkshire Post. They took a picture of this gravestone because it's such a fab stone when they were doing an article on this. And it reads, in memory of John Jones of Ingleton Fells, who died on the 27th of July, 1872, aged 17. And then the quote is, affliction seized my dear son and snatched him from my sight, but Jesus took him to his breast and claimed him as his right. So there's obviously a mother here who's grieving desperately for her son. Now, and this is an accidental death, and accidents were just regarded as something that happened when you're building a state-of-the-art bit of engineering. But no solace to this poor chap's mother. Now, I must say, John Jones is not an easy name to research. And even when I had the death certificate, it didn't make it much easier, because if you call John Jones, there are literally hundreds, probably more. Anyway, we have found some things out about him. At the time of the 1871 census, John's family were living in a navvy hut in Langcliffe, which is just outside Settle. And John's parents were called John Jones Senior, and his mother was called Sarah. And there were 3 young siblings, John, including his 13-year-old brother Thomas, and 2 younger ones. And John, his father, and 13-year-old Thomas were all working on the railway, according to the navvy hut. They also, just like the navvy hut we saw before, they had 5 lodgers living with them. Now, soon after the 1871 census, just a couple of months after, there was a newspaper article which tells us a little bit more about the Jones family, because they had one of their lodgers was called William Turner. Now, William Turner, I won't try and read all of that to you, but was taken to court charged with stealing a slop jacket, a billycock hat, a Bible and a pocket handkerchief, the property of John Jones. And basically, the prisoner left his lodgings early on Saturday morning, was apprehended by P.C. Phillipson, good old P.C. Phillipson, near the Cleetop cutting, which is just the other side of Settle on the Leeds-Lancaster line, with the whole of the missing property in his possession. Now, William, you can't get out of that one, can you? He pleaded guilty and was in prison for a month with hard labour. But it paints another history, typical of the social history that's come out of this research. If you're wondering what a billycock hat is, it's something like this. Bowler hats are very similar, except a billycock hat was made of felt. Allegedly, according to Wikipedia, invented by William Coker, which got changed to billycock. Now, when you typically, and there's a slop jacket, when you typically look at pictures of navvies, I must say there are none of navvies working on the Settle to Carlisle Railway that exist as far as we know, which says a lot anyway, doesn't it, as to how much they were valued. But it is thought that they generally look similar to this. This is your stereotypical picture of navvies. And you'll notice none of those is wearing a billycock hat. Now, it's quite possible the billycock hat was John Jones Senior's Sunday best, or it could be, we were talking about gangs before, he perhaps could have been a gang leader, which is why he had a different hat to his gang. Anyway, the slop jacket, as you can see, is quite typical. Also quite interesting from that article, it mentions that William Turner stole a Bible. Now, if you're a navvy travelling around the country for work with your family and you can only take with you what you can carry, perhaps it's surprising that they were carrying around a Bible with them. But perhaps it also tells us a lot about life in those days, where even rough, coarse navvies still used the Bible and were known to attend church on Sundays, despite everything else that was going on in their life. Anyway, back to young John Jones. Young John Jones, in 1872, yes, we're coming up to his death, I'm afraid. In 1872, in July, he was working as an engine stoker, that's a fireman, and he was working up at Ribblehead. This map is from an old map, and it's you can see there the railway cutting diagonally across the screen, and X marks Battywife Hole, which is where many of the navvy huts were. So The station inn is just on the road, which is still there now. So he was up there working as a fireman on the engine. Oh, I've just noticed that picture looks like it's got some holly on top of the on top of the cabin. I'm sure it wouldn't have done. Anyway, that's what he was doing. And then unfortunately, as we know from his death certificate, on the 27th of July, he was accidentally killed falling from the railway engine, which sounds a really unfortunate way to go. The information was received from Thomas Parkinson Brown, the coroner, who was one of the coroners who ran the inquest for all of our navvies. Now, whenever there was a coroner's inquest, by law, there had to be a newspaper report, which is great for me 150 years later, trying to find out what was going on. And so this newspaper report told us that he was working up at the Ingleton Fells whilst in the act of doing something in connection with his engine, doesn't tell us what, he fell off, coming into contact with the abutment on the side of the engine, causing injuries to his arm and thigh. He was conveyed the same night to the hospital at Settle, but died shortly afterwards. Now, if you've ever been to Ribblehead and Settle, you will know that road from Ribblehead down to Settle will make some people car sick even now. In those days, it would have been in a far worse condition. The railway hadn't been completed, so it'd have had to go by road. And the ambulance in which he was transported was thought to look something like this. It was basically part of the cover, attached to the back of some horses. Now, you've broken your arm and eye, and you're travelling down that lumpy road, 12.5 miles to Settle. That would not have been the most comfortable journey. So let's hope there was some laudanum. We know navvies did pay into sort of an insurance scheme for medical supplies, but even so, not good, and not surprising, he died later. Now, that was tragic and may have been enough for his family, who may have decided they wanted something completely different, which wasn't going to be as dangerous. And funnily enough, the family at the time of the next census in 1881 were found in Hull, in a street called Mytongate, because in December 1880, John Jones Sr. had taken over the tenancy of the Black Swan Inn. Mytongate is one of the main streets through Hull, if you know it today. Now, 2 months after he'd taken over the tenancy, this research, I have to say, I found, this is ongoing, and I've found it since I've written the book. I found this article the other day about poor old John Jones, who's just taken over the pub. And it says, at the police court on Monday, John Jones, landlord of the Black Swan Mytongate, was summoned for allowing his house to be the habitual resort of prostitutes. Goodness gracious. The PC, who was on duty near to the defendant's house, saw a number of prostitutes entering the premises. They went down the passage leading to a concert room at the back of the house. Some of the women, in the opinion of the officers, were more or less the worse for drink. About 10:15, the officers entered the house and waited and visited the concert room, in which they heard bad language used. They found a number of men and from 15 to 20 women, all prostitutes. They watched the house from that time to 5 minutes to 11, when the house was closed. The two officers then went to the landlord and said, "Are you aware you have been harbouring prostitutes?" And Jones said he was not aware that he had. Now, I find it quite interesting they decided to sit there and wait for all that time watching these prostitutes. In actual case, the case was dismissed because they couldn't prove that he knew he had prostitutes in the house. However, it was probably enough for poor old John, because within 6 months of that, he had given up the tenancy to somebody else and then moved back to Wigan, where he worked as an agricultural labourer. So poor old John Jones. So a bit of a bad end there, but not as bad as it was for John Jones, of course. The other children managed to survive and have a reasonable working life, as far as I can gather. So that was poor old John Jones. Now, I have to show you this gravestone, because this gravestone is huge. Now, I asked my dear husband to come down to the graveyard and stand behind the graveyard so you could see how big the gravestone was. And so he did. And you can see, you can hardly see him at all. So I made him move around to the side so you could get a better idea. And there he is standing by the gravestone. Now, one reason for showing you this is because my husband there has got the genes of a railway navvy. His second great grandfather was a tunneler at Black Moss Tunnel on the Settle to Carlisle at the time of the 1871 census. So he's definitely got navvying genes. But anyway, he's just there for the purposes of illustrating the size of that enormous gravestone. And to the right is the inscription of it. Now, it's to the memory of the children of William Spencer of Settle and Frances, his wife. And the first 7 names there are of their children, the oldest of which is 9 years, but the rest are all infants. So unfortunately, typically, they've had 7 children who have died very young, with a nice quote afterwards. And then the poor mum, Frances Spencer, mother to the above, died in 1861, age 50. Then we've got William Henry Spencer, who's our navvy, who dies age 28 in 1873. And then poor old dad, William Spencer, who died in 1884, aged an incredible 73 years, having had all of these members of his family predeceasing him. Unfortunately, his last 10 years were spent in the workhouse, so he was probably a very unhappy man. But let's find out what happened to poor old William Henry Spencer. Now, William Henry Spencer had married Martha Hook from Liverpool, who was 10 years older than him, and they lived in Twistleton's Yard, which is up in Upper Settle, if you know Settle. Again, he was someone who had 2 neighbours who were both navvies who also died as part of this research. Now, his death certificate tells us he was accidentally crushed between 2 wagons and killed, and a coroner's inquest. He was a fireman on the railway, and in the earlier census in 1871, this is in 1873, he was described himself as a mechanic. So the newspaper report of his death basically said that he was crushed between the wagons, as it said. He was working at the new station ground, which is the current Settle station, the old station ground being what we now know as Giggleswick Station, which was there first but renamed. Now, that's obviously really sad, and he died. Out of all of this family, I mean, this is the most unlucky family. There was one other sister who survived all of this lot, and she was a woman called Nancy. And good old Nancy married a man called John Ball, who was a quarry labourer, fortunately not on the railways, and they had 7 sons and 3 daughters. At this time, though, some of these sons were working for the railway as well. And tragically, in 1877, their 16-year-old son, Mark William Ball, committed suicide up at Batty Green. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the death of his uncle contributed to this. Basically, he was sent on an errand by the foreman. The foreman was attending a funeral, ironically enough, so disappeared off and didn't have time to check that he'd come back. William didn't return on the workman's train back in Settle, and his father thought, well, he must have just stayed over with someone. No phones, obviously. And so he was found the next morning. So poor old Mark William Ball, the most unlucky family, you know, that you can think of. However, the book is not all about doom and gloom. There are plenty of other really colourful stories and interesting stories as well. The book covers the life story of the coroners, for example, that recorded that had all the inquests for the deaths. It talks about the surgeons, the interesting life of the surgeons who had to deal with these people, the navvies, not just the deaths, but also the injuries. The stained glass window there is a window dedicated to one of those surgeons. The registrar was a chap called John Cowburn. So obviously on these death certificates, we've got multiple examples of his signature. And an interesting little twist was that in the 1871 census, which isn't very clearly read, you can see on here, his mother was Jane Cowburn, and she had a lodger in her house who was called Robert E. Wilson. This was Robert Edward Wilson, and he was 29 years old, described himself as a civil engineer, and he was from Leeds. Now, it turns out that he was the resident engineer for the southern part of the Settle to Dent line. There was another chap called Edgar Oswald Ferguson, who was 24, who was living in Giggleswick at the same time, who was in charge of the northern end. So these were the resident engineers who were overseeing the building of the railway. And I find it incredible that you've got two men in their 20s who are overseeing the building of this railway. They were accountable to a very experienced chap, John Sidney Crossley, who was overseeing it, but he was nowhere near at this point. He was in Loughborough at the time. But quite incredible, these two young men were overseeing the railway of this fantastic railway. The book also covers stories of people who made a fortune from investments and people who lost a fortune. There's some really interesting entrepreneurs. You can be an entrepreneur legally, but we have an example of a couple who were illegal entrepreneurs who still managed to do quite well for themselves. And we also have some details of some accidents as well. Obviously, there were loads of those. So the whole book, I hope you find colourful. I hope you find it as a celebration. It's about time we remembered these navvies and what they'd achieved. This was a lovely quote that was given by a woman called Elizabeth Garnett, who was a founder of the Navvy Missionary Society. She's one of the middle-class women that wanted to work with the navvies to improve their lives. And she said at the time, one of the few people to recognise the work of the navvies at the time, certainly no men in all the world so improve their country as navvies do in England. Their work will last for ages, and if the world remains so long, people will come in hundreds of years to look and wonder at what they have done. And indeed, that is what we're doing today. So, thank you for bearing with me through that whistle-stop tour of highlights from the book. If you would like a copy of the book, it's an A5 size. Brian held it up at the beginning. There it is. It's just A5. It's not massive, so it's only £3. It's an ideal stocking filler, I have to say, obviously. And all the proceeds of it go to local charities, including the Friends of the Settle in Carlisle. My project email is on there. You can get it direct from me. And if you're anywhere near Settle, I'm very happy to deliver. You can get it from the Friends of Settle Carlisle shop online, or Yorkshire Dales Millennium Trust online. And if you're anywhere near Settle, you can pick it up in Limestone Books or the station shop. Just one other thing to look out for, on the back of this, while this work was being put together, Channel 5 got in touch. They'd heard about it. And if you happen to look out next spring, there's a new series of the world's most scenic railways featuring the Settle in Carlisle. And I helped them with a little bit of filming on what was one of the coldest days in October, with hail, wind and rain, as it only can up at St Leonard's. So you may want to look out for that as well. Thank you very much. And I do hope if you get a copy of the book, you enjoy it immensely. Thank you very much. I'll now switch off and we'll finish it there. Just 1 second.